745 7th Avenue. Most people walk past without a second glance. This was Lehman Brothers, fourth largest investment bank in America. Survived the Civil War, 2 World Wars, the Great Depression. 158 years, dead in a weekend. The building's still there. The name isn't. How does something that powerful just vanish? The empire before the fall. Let's start when things were good, really good. Because you need to understand what Lehman Brothers was at its peak to appreciate how spectacular the fall became. By 2007, Lehman Brothers wasn't just successful. It was a Wall Street titan. The firm employed over 25,000 people worldwide. It had offices in every major financial centre: London, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Frankfurt. The company was reporting record profits year after year. In 2007 alone, Lehman posted net income of over $4 billion. The headquarters at 745 7th Avenue reflected that success. 32 floors of prime Manhattan real estate. The building had been renovated specifically for Lehman when they moved there in the early 2000s. Glass and steel, modern architecture, the kind of place that screamed money and power. The lobby was impressive. Polished marble floors, high ceilings, security desks staffed by people in suits. You needed a badge to get past the turnstiles. Visitors had to check in, get temporary badges, be escorted upstairs. This wasn't just office space. This was fortress, sanctuary, temple all rolled into one. Walking into that building felt like entering the engine room of capitalism. The trading floors were massive open spaces filled with hundreds of desks, each with multiple computer screens showing real-time market data from around the world. The noise was constant. Phones ringing, traders shouting orders, the electronic beeps and chirps of trading systems executing deals worth millions. Each desk had a turret phone system with dozens of direct lines to other traders, to clients, to counterparties around the world. Traders could execute deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars with a few keystrokes and a phone call. The speed, the volume, the sheer amount of money moving through those floors every day was staggering. The executives had offices on the upper floors with views of Manhattan that cost more per square foot than most Americans' entire houses. Corner offices with original artwork on the walls, conference rooms with Italian marble and custom furniture. The 31st floor was Executive Row, where the most senior leaders had their offices. The views up there stretched from the Hudson River to the East River, Manhattan laid out below like a map of money and power. This wasn't just a workplace, it was a monument to financial success. Richard Fuld was the CEO. He'd been running Lehman since 1993, and under his leadership, the firm had grown exponentially. Fuld was known on Wall Street as the Gorilla, not a friendly nickname. He had a reputation for being tough, aggressive, demanding, the kind of CEO who expected total loyalty and delivered harsh consequences for failure. People who worked directly with Fuld described him as intense. He'd chew out executives in meetings if results weren't what he expected. He demanded complete dedication to the firm. If you worked for Lehman, especially if you worked at a senior level, Lehman came first. Before family, before personal life, before everything. But he also delivered results. Lehman's stock price had climbed from under $3 per share in the early 1990s to over $80 by early 2007. Employees who'd been there for years, who'd received stock options as part of their compensation, had become wealthy. Not just comfortable. Wealthy. The culture inside Lehman was intense. You worked long hours. 60, 70, 80 hours a week was normal. You came in early, you stayed late. You were available on weekends. Junior analysts would arrive at 6 in the morning and leave at midnight. Senior bankers would be on calls with Asian markets before dawn and European markets after dinner. But the payoff was worth it. junior analysts fresh out of business school could make six figures their first year. Senior traders and investment bankers were pulling in millions annually in salary and bonuses. Managing directors, the top tier, could make 10, 20, even 50 million in a good year. The bonus culture was everything. Your base salary was fine, but the bonus was where the real money came from. Bonuses were announced in January based on the previous year's performance. People would spend December obsessing over what their number would be, comparing notes with colleagues, trying to figure out who was getting what. When bonus day arrived, it was like Christmas for adults who measured their worth in dollars. There was arrogance. How could there not be? When you're consistently making money, when your bonuses keep getting bigger, when every year sets a new record, you start to believe you're smarter than everyone else, that the rules don't quite apply to you the same way. Lehman people had a swagger. They knew they worked for one of the most successful firms on Wall Street. They networked with each other, socialized with each other, married each other. The firm became their entire world. Friendships, relationships, identity, everything was tied to Lehman Brothers. The firm's history added to the mystique. Founded in 1850, back when America was still figuring out what it was going to be. The Lehman family had started with a dry goods store in Alabama, then moved into cotton trading, then into finance. By the early 1900s, Lehman Brothers was underwriting stock offerings and financing the growth of major American companies. They'd survived the panic of 1907, the crash of 1929, and the Great Depression. They'd helped finance the post-World War II economic boom. They'd navigated the inflation of the 1970s, the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s. 158 years of surviving and thriving. That history created a sense of invincibility. We've been through everything. We're survivors. We know how to navigate crises. This belief was deeply embedded in the firm's culture. Lehman specialized in several areas, but by the mid-2000s, one area in particular was driving massive profits: real estate, specifically mortgages and mortgage-backed securities. The housing market was booming. Home prices were rising everywhere. People were buying houses they couldn't really afford, and banks were giving them mortgages anyway because housing prices only went up, right? Lehman was in the middle of this. They'd originate mortgages through their lending subsidiaries. They'd bundle those mortgages into securities and sell them to investors. They'd keep some on their own books as investments. The whole machine was generating enormous profits. They'd also use borrowed money to amplify their returns, a practice called leverage. By 2007, Lehman's leverage ratio was over 30-1. For every dollar they actually owned, they'd borrowed 30 more to invest. This meant their returns on equity were spectacular. A small profit on an investment became a huge profit when you factor in the leverage. When everything's going up, leverage makes you look like a genius. Your returns are amplified. A small gain becomes a huge profit. Portfolio managers and traders who used leverage effectively were rewarded with massive bonuses. The more risk you took, the more you could potentially make. But leverage works both ways. When things go down, your losses are also amplified. And Lehman was about to learn that lesson the hardest way possible. But in early 2007, none of that mattered. The bonuses were big. The offices were luxurious. The future looked bright. Lehman Brothers seemed invincible. And that's exactly when the cracks started showing. The first tremors. The housing market started showing problems in late 2006 and early 2007. Nothing catastrophic at first. Just small signs that maybe things weren't as solid as everyone thought. Home prices stopped rising in some markets. Then they started falling slightly. Foreclosures began ticking up. People who'd taken out mortgages they couldn't afford were starting to default. Subprime mortgages, they were called. Loans given to borrowers with poor credit, high debt, unstable income. risky borrowers who paid higher interest rates to compensate for that risk. The subprime market had exploded in the early 2000s. Lenders were giving mortgages to anyone with a pulse. No income verification, no down payment required. Adjustable rate mortgages that started with low teaser rates, then reset to much higher rates after a few years. The assumption was always that borrowers could refinance before the reset, using the increased value of their homes as collateral. But that only worked if home prices kept rising. When they stopped rising, when they started falling, the whole system broke down. Borrowers couldn't refinance. They couldn't afford the higher payments when their rates reset. They defaulted. The houses went into foreclosure. The lenders took losses. Lehman had a lot of exposure to subprime mortgages, both directly through loans they'd made and indirectly through mortgage-backed securities they owned. But the firm's leadership kept saying everything was fine. The housing market was just experiencing a normal correction. Things would stabilize. This wasn't a crisis. In the spring of 2007, a company called New Century Financial filed for bankruptcy. They'd been one of the largest subprime mortgage lenders in the country. Their collapse sent ripples through the financial industry. If a major mortgage lender could fail, what did that say about the mortgages they'd originated? About the securities backed by those mortgages? Wall Street started getting nervous. Not panicked, but nervous. Lehman's stock price started declining. Not dramatically, just a slow slide downward. Investors were starting to ask questions about how much exposure Lehman had to subprime mortgages. The firm's executives gave reassuring answers. They said their risk management was sound. They said they'd been careful about the quality of mortgages they'd invested in. But inside the building at 745 7th Avenue, the mood was shifting. The trading floors were still busy, still noisy, but there was an undercurrent of tension. Risk managers were running stress tests, trying to figure out what would happen if housing prices dropped by 10%, 15%, 20%. The results weren't comforting. The firm had a chief risk officer, Madeline Antoncic. She'd been raising concerns about Lehman's real estate exposure for months. She was pushing for the firm to reduce its positions, to build up capital reserves, to prepare for potential losses. But her warnings weren't being heeded. She ended up leaving the firm in early 2008, frustrated that her risk concerns were being ignored. This was a pattern at Lehman and across Wall Street. The people responsible for making money, the traders and investment bankers, had more power and influence than the people responsible for managing risk. When risk managers said we should pull back, the revenue generators said we're making too much money to stop now. And in a firm where compensation was tied directly to profits, the revenue generators usually won those arguments. Some executives started pushing to reduce Lehman's real estate exposure, sell off some of the mortgage-backed securities, stop originating new risky loans, build up cash reserves as a cushion. But that would mean taking losses on securities they'd have to sell at depressed prices. It would mean lower profits. It would mean smaller bonuses. It would mean admitting they'd made mistakes. Richard Fuld resisted. He believed the market would recover. He believed Lehman's positions were solid. He believed the firm could ride this out. And maybe he was right to believe that. Lehman had survived crises before. The firm had been around since 1850. It had weathered the panic of 1873, the crash of 1929, the recession of the 1970s. Why would this be different? But this was different. The scale of leverage, the complexity of the securities, the interconnectedness of the global financial system, all of it made this crisis fundamentally different from anything that had come before. The old playbook didn't work anymore. By the summer of 2007, things were getting worse. More mortgage lenders were failing. Housing prices were dropping in more markets. The securities backed by subprime mortgages were losing value rapidly. Investors who owned these securities were trying to sell them, but there weren't many buyers. which drove prices down further. In August 2007, a French bank called BNP Paribas announced they were freezing withdrawals from 3 investment funds because they couldn't accurately value the mortgage-backed securities the funds owned. That announcement triggered something close to panic in financial markets. If a major European bank couldn't value these securities, what did that mean for everyone else who owned them? The problem was that these securities were supposed to be easy to value. They were rated by rating agencies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's. Many had been given AAA ratings, the highest possible grade, supposedly as safe as government bonds. But it turned out the ratings were garbage. The agencies had given high ratings to securities that were actually full of risky subprime mortgages because the banks issuing the securities paid the rating agencies for the ratings. Conflict of interest much? Lehman's stock dropped sharply. In a matter of weeks, it went from the 60s down to the 40s. The firm reported its first quarterly loss in years. Not a huge loss, but a loss nonetheless. The streak of record profits was over. Employees started getting worried, not about their jobs yet, but about their bonuses, about their stock options that were suddenly worth a lot less, about whether this was temporary or the beginning of something worse. The executives were worried too, but they couldn't show it. They had to project confidence. They had to reassure investors, clients, employees, regulators. Everything is under control. We're managing our risk. We have adequate capital. The fundamentals of our business are strong. But inside the risk management meetings, inside the executive sessions, people were starting to realize this might be more serious than a normal market correction. The housing market wasn't stabilizing, it was collapsing. And Lehman Brothers was sitting on tens of billions of dollars in real estate-related assets that were declining in value every single day. The question wasn't whether Lehman would take losses. The question was how big those losses would be and whether the firm had enough capital to absorb them. The dominoes start falling. March 2008. Bear Stearns collapsed. Bear Stearns was the 5th largest investment bank in America. Like Lehman, they'd been heavily involved in mortgage-backed securities. Like Lehman, they'd used massive amounts of leverage. When the mortgage market collapsed, Bear Stearns couldn't cover their losses. They couldn't meet their obligations. In a matter of days, they went from a functioning investment bank to a firm on the verge of bankruptcy. The collapse happened with terrifying speed. On a Monday, Bear Stearns was telling investors and clients they had adequate liquidity. By Thursday, they were out of cash. The Federal Reserve had to arrange emergency financing just to keep them operating through the weekend. By the following Monday, the deal was done. Bear Stearns was being acquired. The Federal Reserve and JP Morgan Chase orchestrated a rescue. JP Morgan agreed to buy Bear Stearns for $2 per share. $2. A year earlier, Bear Stearns stock had been trading at over $160. The shareholders got almost nothing. The employees lost their jobs or got absorbed into JP Morgan at reduced positions. The $2 price was initially increased to $10 per share after shareholders revolted. But either way, it was a devastation of wealth. Employees who'd been paid largely in stock and stock options watched their net worth evaporate. People who'd thought they were on track to retire comfortably found themselves essentially starting over financially. Everyone on Wall Street watched this happen with a mixture of shock and fear. If Bear Stearns could collapse that fast, any of them could be next. The remaining investment banks started looking at their own positions, their own vulnerabilities, with fresh eyes and growing dread. The Bear Stearns collapse revealed how fragile the whole system was. These firms depended on short-term funding to finance their long-term investments. Every day, they had to borrow billions of dollars just to keep operating. This funding came from money market funds, from other banks, from corporate treasuries. It was called the repo market, short for repurchase agreements. When lenders lost confidence in a firm, they'd stop lending. or they'd demand more collateral, or they'd charge higher interest rates. And once that process started, it could become a death spiral. You need to borrow money to meet your obligations. Lenders won't lend because they're worried you can't pay them back. You can't meet your obligations. Lenders' fears are confirmed. The firm collapses. Bear Stearns had died from exactly this kind of modern bank run, not depositors lining up to withdraw their savings like in the Great Depression, but sophisticated institutional investors refusing to lend overnight, which had the same effect. At Lehman Brothers, the executives knew they were in trouble. The firm had even more real estate exposure than Bear Stearns had. Their leverage was higher. Their capital cushion was thinner. If the market turned against them the way it had turned against Bear Stearns, Lehman might not survive either. Richard Fuld and his team started exploring options. Could they raise more capital? Could they sell off some divisions to generate cash? Could they find a buyer for the whole firm? These conversations were happening in conference rooms on the upper floors of 745 7th Avenue, behind closed doors, with only the most senior executives present. The atmosphere in those meetings was tense. These were people who'd spent their careers projecting confidence and control. Now they were facing the possibility that their firm might fail, that everything they'd built might collapse. The discussions got heated. Some executives wanted to take drastic action immediately. Others believed they could muddle through. Fuld tried to balance the competing viewpoints while also dealing with the external pressures from investors, regulators, and the media. They tried to raise capital. In June 2008, Lehman announced they were raising $6 billion by selling new stock and preferred shares. It was supposed to be a show of strength. Look, investors still believe in us. We're building our capital cushion. Everything's fine. But the market saw it differently. The market saw a firm that was desperate for cash. Why else would you dilute your shareholders by selling new stock if you weren't desperate? Lehman's stock price kept falling. By June, it was down to $30 per share. By July, it was in the 20s. Lehman also tried to sell assets. They put their investment management division up for sale. This was a profitable business managing money for institutional clients. But the timing was terrible. Who wants to buy assets from a struggling firm? The potential buyers knew Lehman was desperate and bid accordingly. The prices being offered were far below what the division was worth in normal times. The firm tried to spin off some of their real estate assets into a separate company that shareholders would own, a strategy they called SpinCo. The idea was to get the toxic assets off Lehman's balance sheet without having to sell them at fire sale prices. But the plan was complicated, and investors didn't have confidence it would work. Inside the building, the mood had changed completely. The trading floors were still busy, but the energy was different. Traders were starting to look for other jobs, quietly updating their resumes, reaching out to contacts at other firms. Junior employees were worried about being laid off. Senior employees were worried about their stock options becoming worthless. The cafeteria conversations changed. Instead of talking about deals and bonuses, people were talking about whether the firm would survive, whether they should get out now or stick it through, whether their loyalty to Lehman was going to be rewarded or whether they were going down with the ship. There were layoffs. Lehman announced they were cutting 1,500 jobs, about 6% of their workforce. The people who were let go had to pack up their desks and leave the building under the eyes of security. It was humiliating. These were people who'd worked 70-hour weeks for years, who'd dedicated themselves to the firm, and now they were being escorted out like criminals. The process was cold. You'd get called into a meeting with HR. They'd tell you your position was being eliminated. You'd have an hour to pack your desk. Security would watch you to make sure you didn't take any confidential information or sabotage anything. Then you'd hand in your badge and you were out. Some people saw it coming. If your division was losing money, if your business wasn't generating revenue, you knew you were vulnerable. Others were blindsided. They thought they were safe because they'd been there for years or because they had good relationships with their bosses. But in a crisis, none of that mattered. The cuts were about numbers, not people. The employees who remained weren't much better off. They knew more layoffs were coming. They knew the firm was struggling. They could see the stock price falling every day. Some of them had most of their wealth tied up in Lehman stock and stock options. They were watching their net worth evaporate in real time. The executives were trying to find a buyer. They approached several banks, both domestic and international. Would you be interested in acquiring Lehman Brothers? Or maybe a strategic partnership? An investment? Bank of America looked at Lehman's books. Barclays took a serious look. HSBC was mentioned as a possibility. Korean Development Bank was rumoured to be interested. But one by one, they all walked away. Nobody wanted to buy. The potential acquirers would look at Lehman's books, see the massive real estate exposure, see the leveraged positions, and walk away. The risk was too high. The potential losses were too unpredictable. Why buy a sinking ship? By August 2008, it was clear that Lehman was in serious trouble. The firm reported a loss of almost $4 billion for the second quarter. $4 billion. In one quarter. The stock price dropped into the teens. Employees started leaving. Not just the ones who got laid off. The ones who had options. The top performers who could get hired elsewhere. They saw what was coming, and they got out while they could. The brain drain made things worse. You can't run an investment bank without talented people, and the talented people were heading for the exits. Richard Fuld was still fighting. He believed he could save the firm. He was in constant contact with regulators, with potential investors, with other CEOs. He was working 18-hour days trying to find a solution. But the options were running out. The building at 745 7th Avenue, which had felt like the centre of the financial universe just a year earlier, now felt like a ship taking on water. People were bailing as fast as they could, but the water was rising faster. The final weekend. September 12th, 2008, Friday afternoon. Lehman Brothers had days left, maybe hours. The stock closed at $3.65 per share. The firm's market value had dropped from $45 billion to less than $2 billion in a matter of months. Throughout the weekend, there was a desperate push to save Lehman. The Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve brought together executives from all the major Wall Street banks. The meeting was at the New York Federal Reserve Building downtown, but everyone knew what was being decided would determine Lehman's fate. Two potential buyers emerged, Bank of America and Barclays, a British bank. Both were interested, but both wanted the government to provide financial support for the deal. They wanted the Fed to absorb some of Lehman's toxic assets, to reduce the risk for the acquiring bank. At 745 7th Avenue, a skeleton crew of executives and lawyers waited for news. The building, usually bustling even on weekends, was eerily quiet. Conference rooms were occupied by small groups having hushed conversations. People checked their phones obsessively, waiting for updates. Lehman employees who weren't at the office were at home, watching the news, calling each other, trying to figure out what was going to happen. Would there be a deal? Would they still have jobs on Monday? Would their stock be worth anything? The government made a decision. They would not provide support for a Lehman acquisition. They believed that the market needed to learn that firms could fail, that bailouts weren't automatic, that moral hazard needed to be addressed. They thought the financial system could absorb Lehman's failure. They were catastrophically wrong, but they didn't know that yet. Bank of America pulled out. They announced they were buying Merrill Lynch instead, another struggling investment bank. Barclays pulled out too. British regulators wouldn't approve the deal without government support, and the US government wasn't offering support. Saturday night, it became clear there would be no rescue. Lehman Brothers was going to file for bankruptcy. The announcement came Sunday, September 14th, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, the largest bankruptcy in American history. Over $600 billion in assets, 25,000 employees, 158 years of history. Gone. That Sunday, employees were told to come to the office to collect their personal belongings. Security was tight, people were crying, some were angry, shouting about how the executives had destroyed the firm. Others were numb, just going through the motions of packing up their desks. 20-year veterans were leaving with cardboard boxes full of family photos and coffee mugs. Young analysts who joined right out of college were walking out unemployed, their promising finance careers suddenly derailed. Everyone was trying to process what had just happened. The trading floor looked like a graveyard. Computer screens were dark. Phones weren't ringing. The energy and noise that had defined the place was gone. Just empty desks and shocked people trying to comprehend the magnitude of what they'd just lost. Richard Fuld was in his office on the upper floor. He'd been working around the clock all weekend, making calls, trying to find any possible solution right up until the end. Now there was nothing left to do. The firm he'd run for 15 years was bankrupt. The building he'd walked into as CEO was no longer really his. Outside the building, news cameras were set up. Reporters were doing live shots describing the bankruptcy. Curious onlookers gathered on the sidewalk, taking photos, trying to witness this historic moment. Inside, the people who'd built their careers and their lives around Lehman Brothers were leaving for the last time. But the real consequences were just beginning. The shock wave. Monday, September 15th, 2008. The stock market opened and immediately plunged. The Dow Jones dropped over 500 points. Not because Lehman failed, because everyone suddenly realized if Lehman could fail, any financial institution could fail. Panic spread through the global financial system. Banks stopped trusting each other. If you couldn't be sure which banks were sitting on huge losses from mortgage-backed securities, why would you lend to any of them? Credit markets froze. Banks stopped lending to each other, even for overnight loans. AIG, one of the largest insurance companies in the world, was on the verge of collapse. They'd sold insurance on mortgage-backed securities, and now they couldn't cover the claims. The government stepped in with an $85 billion bailout. So much for no more rescues. Money market funds started breaking the buck, meaning they couldn't guarantee their investors would get their full money back. These were supposed to be completely safe investments, as stable as bank accounts. People started pulling their money out en masse. Within days, the government was rolling out massive intervention programs. TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, $700 billion to stabilize the financial system. Emergency lending facilities, guarantees on bank deposits, the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates to near zero. The recession that had been building accelerated into free fall. Companies started laying off workers by the thousands. The unemployment rate climbed. Housing prices continued to collapse. The stock market lost trillions of dollars in value. This wasn't just a financial crisis anymore. This was a global economic catastrophe. And the spark that ignited it all was the decision to let Lehman Brothers fail. Economists still debate whether saving Lehman would have prevented the financial crisis or just delayed it. But there's no debate about what actually happened. The failure of Lehman Brothers turned a serious financial problem into the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. At 745 7th Avenue, the building was being emptied out. Bankruptcy trustees were taking inventory of assets. Valuable artwork was being catalogued for eventual sale. Computer equipment was being removed. The offices that had symbolized Wall Street power and wealth were being stripped bare. Lehman employees scattered. Some found jobs at other financial firms, though positions were scarce since everyone was cutting staff. Some left finance entirely, going to other industries or starting over in new careers. Some couldn't find work at all. Their specialized skills in investment banking suddenly worthless in a collapsing economy. The senior executives became targets. Richard Fuld was called to testify before Congress. He was grilled about his compensation, about the firm's risk management, about whether he'd misled investors. He defended his decisions, but the public wanted someone to blame, and he was the most visible target. Some former Lehman employees lost everything. Their salaries were gone. Their stock options were worthless. Their 401k accounts that had been heavily invested in Lehman stock were decimated. People who'd thought they were on track to retire comfortably found themselves starting over financially in their 50s. The lawsuits started. Shareholders sued, claiming the executives had misrepresented the firm's financial condition. Creditors sued, fighting over whatever assets remained. Employees sued over lost pensions and benefits. The bankruptcy proceedings would drag on for years, lawyers getting rich while everyone else fought over the scraps. The aftermath and the empty halls. The bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers officially concluded in 2012, almost 4 years after the initial filing. The firm's assets were liquidated. Creditors recovered some of what they were owed, though not everything. Shareholders got essentially nothing. 745 7th Avenue remained standing, of course. Buildings don't declare bankruptcy. But the Lehman Brothers name was gone from the facade. The company that had occupied it no longer existed. For a while, the building was partially empty. Other tenants occupied some floors, but large sections sat vacant. The former Lehman spaces were eerily quiet. Conference rooms that had hosted billion-dollar deals were empty. Trading floors that had hummed with activity were silent and dark. Eventually, other companies leased the space. The building was renovated again. New tenants moved in. Life moved on. If you visit 745 7th Avenue today, you'd never know it had been the headquarters of one of America's most powerful investment banks. There's no plaque, no memorial, nothing to mark what happened there. But the people who worked there remember. Former Lehman employees still talk about those days, some with nostalgia for the good times, the huge bonuses, the sense of being part of something powerful. Others with bitterness about how it ended, about the losses they suffered, about the careers that were destroyed. The financial industry changed after Lehman. New regulations were imposed. Banks were required to hold more capital. Leverage limits were established. Stress tests became mandatory. The idea was to prevent another firm from becoming too big to fail, or at least to make sure that if one did fail, it wouldn't take down the entire economy. Whether those changes worked is debatable. Banks are bigger now than they were before the crisis. The financial system is more concentrated. The same arguments about too big to fail still apply. We haven't really solved the fundamental problems that led to 2008. We've just made some adjustments and hoped they'd be enough. Richard Fuld never ran another major company. He became a symbol of Wall Street excess and failure. Fair or not, his legacy is tied to Lehman's collapse. He's wealthy enough that he'll never have to worry about money, which is more than can be said for many of his former employees. The building at 745 7th Avenue is just a building now. Modern, glass and steel, filled with companies doing business. Nothing special about it except its history. And even that history is fading. The financial crisis is old news. Younger people entering finance today weren't even working in 2008. To them, Lehman Brothers is just a case study in business school, not a real place where real people lost their jobs and their savings. But the lessons from Lehman should matter. The danger of excessive leverage, the risk of concentrating too much exposure in one type of asset, the importance of actually understanding the securities you're trading, the reality that firms that seem invincible can collapse almost overnight. Whether we've actually learned those lessons is another question. The human cost. Behind the trillion-dollar losses and the global economic crisis were actual people whose lives got destroyed. Jennifer worked in Lehman's Human Resources department. She'd been with the firm for 12 years. Not a trader, not an executive, just someone doing an office job. When Lehman collapsed, she lost her position, her stock options, and a significant chunk of her retirement savings. She was 47 years old and had to start over. She eventually found work at a much smaller company for half her previous salary. Her retirement plans evaporated. The college fund she'd been building for her daughter disappeared. Michael was a managing director in the real estate division. He'd worked at Lehman for nearly 20 years. He was making millions per year in salary and bonuses. He had stock options worth tens of millions of dollars on paper. After the bankruptcy, those options became worthless. His savings were substantial, but nowhere near enough to replace the wealth he'd expected to have. He was in his early 50s, too young to retire, but too senior and too expensive for most firms to want to hire. He ended up doing consulting work, making a fraction of what he'd earned before. The support staff had it worse. Secretaries, IT workers, facilities managers. These weren't people making millions. They were middle-class workers with middle-class salaries who'd had stable jobs at what they thought was a stable company. When Lehman failed, they lost their jobs in the middle of the worst recession in decades. Finding new work was nearly impossible. The unemployment rate was climbing. Companies everywhere were laying people off, and there were 10 applicants for every open position. Some Lehman employees had been encouraged to invest heavily in company stock. It was part of the culture. You believe in the firm, you own the firm. When the stock price was climbing, that seemed smart. When the firm went bankrupt, those employees lost everything. Retirement accounts that had been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars became worth pennies on the dollar after bankruptcy proceedings. Marriages fell apart. The stress of sudden unemployment, of catastrophic financial losses, of uncertain futures, destroyed relationships. Couples who'd been together for decades found themselves fighting about money, about blame, about what to do next. The divorce rate among former Lehman employees was noticeably higher than the general population in the years after the collapse. Mental health suffered. Depression, anxiety, stress-related illnesses. Some former employees described the period after Lehman's collapse as traumatic. Not just losing a job, but losing an identity. For people who defined themselves by their careers, by their positions at a prestigious firm, the bankruptcy was existential. There were a few cases where former employees took their own lives in the years after the collapse. The official causes were listed as health-related or personal, but their families and friends knew that the loss of their careers and their financial security had been major factors. The junior employees had a different kind of problem. Many of them had joined Lehman right out of top business schools. They'd taken on student debt to get those degrees, expecting to pay it off quickly with their Wall Street salaries. Then the firm collapsed before they'd even paid off their loans. They were in their mid-20s, unemployed, with six-figure student debt and minimal experience. The career path they'd planned disappeared overnight. Former Lehman employees formed informal support networks. They'd meet for drinks, commiserate, share job leads. There was a bond between them, a shared experience of having been through something catastrophic. Some stayed in touch for years, checking in on each other, helping where they could. But there was also resentment. The employees who'd lost their jobs and their savings watched as some of the senior executives walked away with significant wealth. Sure, they'd lost a lot too, but they'd also made tens or hundreds of millions during the good years. They had enough cushion to absorb the losses. The average employees didn't. The bankruptcy proceedings distributed some money to former employees for lost wages and benefits, but it was a fraction of what they'd expected, and it took years to arrive. People who needed money immediately to pay mortgages and support families had to wait while lawyers and bankruptcy trustees worked through the process. Some former Lehman employees left finance entirely. They'd seen how unstable it could be, how quickly a successful career could turn into unemployment. They went into other fields, taking their analytical skills and their work ethic to industries that seemed more stable, teaching, consulting, starting their own businesses. Others stayed in finance, determined to rebuild their careers. They took positions at smaller firms or at divisions of larger banks, working their way back up. The Lehman bankruptcy became a line on their resume, something they'd have to explain in job interviews. Were you part of the problem? Did you see it coming? Why should we trust you now? The city of New York lost thousands of high-paying jobs when Lehman collapsed. That meant less tax revenue, less spending at local businesses, less economic activity. The neighborhoods where Lehman employees had lived felt the impact. Home values declined. Local stores lost customers. The ripple effect spread far beyond 745 7th Avenue. What it means? Lehman Brothers wasn't just a company that failed. It was a symbol of an entire era of financial capitalism that crashed and burned. The firm embodied the belief that smart people using sophisticated financial engineering could eliminate risk. That leverage was just a tool to amplify returns. That housing prices would always go up. That the good times would keep rolling indefinitely. All of those beliefs turned out to be wrong. The mistakes Lehman made weren't unique. Lots of firms were doing similar things. Bear Stearns collapsed first. Merrill Lynch had to be rescued. AIG nearly failed. Citigroup and Bank of America needed government support. Lehman just happened to be the one that didn't get saved, the one that became the symbol of the crisis. But why wasn't Lehman saved? That's still debated. Some say the government didn't realise how bad the consequences would be. They thought the market could absorb one major firm failing. They were wrong, but they didn't know it at the time. Others say it was political. The government had been criticised for bailing out Bear Stearns. There was pressure to let the market work, to let a firm fail, to impose some discipline on Wall Street. Lehman was the unlucky one that got chosen to make that point. Still others say it was practical. Lehman's problems were so deep, their losses so large, that saving them would have required an enormous government commitment. Maybe too large to be politically feasible or financially practical. Whatever the reason, the decision to let Lehman fail without government support turned a serious financial problem into a global catastrophe. The cascading effects brought the entire financial system to the edge of collapse. Only massive government intervention prevented a complete meltdown. The irony is that after letting Lehman fail to avoid moral hazard, the government ended up doing much larger bailouts anyway. AIG got $85 billion. Banks got hundreds of billions through TARP. The Fed created trillions of dollars in emergency lending programs. So the moral hazard argument didn't hold up. We just got the worst of both worlds. A major firm failing and causing chaos, plus massive bailouts anyway. The building at 745 7th Avenue stands as a physical reminder of all this. Not intentionally, it's just a building. But for people who know the history, it represents the peak of an era and the catastrophic end of that era. Wall Street has moved on. The financial industry recovered. Banks are profitable again. Bonuses are big again. In some ways, it's like 2008 never happened. The people running major financial firms now are making the same arguments about sophisticated risk management and efficient markets that the Lehman executives were making before everything collapsed. Maybe the regulations put in place after the crisis are enough to prevent another Lehman. Maybe the stress tests and capital requirements and oversight will work. Or maybe we're just setting up for the next crisis, waiting for the next firm to make the same mistakes in a slightly different way. The former Lehman employees who lost their jobs and their savings haven't forgotten. They know how quickly success can turn into disaster. They know that the people at the top of these firms aren't infallible, that their confidence can be misplaced, that their risk models can be wrong. but their voices get lost in the noise of a booming market and rising stock prices. When times are good, nobody wants to hear warnings about risk. Nobody wants to remember what happened last time. Lehman Brothers operated for 158 years, from a small dry goods store in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1850 to a Wall Street powerhouse. Through the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, 2 World Wars, the Great Depression, the dot-com bubble, the firm survived everything until it didn't. The headquarters at 745 7th Avenue was occupied by Lehman for just over 20 years. A brief period in the building's existence, an even briefer moment in the long history of the firm. But that moment contained the peak of Lehman's power and its catastrophic collapse. What remains? A building that's been renovated and re-leased, former employees scattered across the country, some successful in new careers, others still struggling with the aftermath. Billions of dollars in losses that were eventually absorbed by creditors, shareholders, and taxpayers. An economy that took years to recover from the crisis that Lehman's failure helped trigger. The lessons should be clear. Excessive leverage is dangerous. Concentrating risk in one type of asset is foolish. Believing you're too smart to fail is arrogant and wrong. Regulatory oversight matters. Banks that are too big to fail are too big to exist. But whether we've actually learned those lessons is questionable. The financial system today looks a lot like it did before 2008. Maybe we've made enough changes to prevent the next crisis. Or maybe we're just waiting for history to repeat itself. 745 7th Avenue doesn't care. It's just a building. It'll outlast the companies that occupy it, the crises that shake the economy, the people who work inside its walls. In another 50 years, maybe nobody will remember that Lehman Brothers was ever there. But for now, if you know where to look, you can still see the ghosts. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. 250,000 electric lights. Opening night, May 16th, 1903. 60,000 people crammed through the gates in 2 hours. The park cost 10 cents to enter. By July 4th, the owners had paid back 90% of their $700,000 investment. By 1944, most of it burned to the ground. What was left closed a month later. The site became housing projects. This is Luna Park, the most influential amusement park ever built. And you're about to find out how 2 guys from nowhere created something that changed entertainment forever, then watched it all collapse. The setup. Let's start in Buffalo, New York. 1901, the Pan American Exposition, one of those massive world's fairs where countries and companies showed off the latest technology and entertainment. 2 men met there who should not have gotten along. Frederick Thompson, born in Irontown, Ohio in 1873, trained as an architect. Creative, artistic, completely reckless with money. His father worked in steel mills and moved the family constantly. Thompson studied drafting, won some design competitions, worked various exhibition jobs. Elmer Scipio Dundee, born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1862. Everyone called him Skip, son of a federal judge appointed by Lincoln. Buffalo Bill Cody used to visit the Dundee house and tell stories about the frontier. Skip worked as a law clerk, hated it, got into the amusement business instead. They'd actually met before at an 1898 exposition in Omaha. Thompson had a show called Darkness and Dawn. Dundee had backed someone else's attractions. Both made some money. Both lost some money. Neither particularly impressed the other. Then came Buffalo. Thompson had this idea for a ride called A Trip to the Moon. Except when he went to apply for exhibition space, he found out Dundee had already submitted an application for Darkness and Dawn, using Thompson's exact concept. Thompson hadn't copyrighted it. Most people would have started a fight. Thompson did something smarter. He pitched Dundee on becoming partners. Thompson had the creative vision. Dundee knew how to raise money and run a business. Thompson offered to share his moon ride idea if Dundee would let him in on the other concessions Dundee had already secured. Dundee agreed immediately. He recognized genius when he saw it. A Trip to the Moon opened on May 23, 1901, 3 days after the exposition began. The ride was spectacular. Visitors boarded a wooden ship with flapping wings called Luna. The ship rocked and swayed. Breezes blew across passengers' faces. Lightning flashed. A narrator described the journey. The ship flew over a painted panorama showing Niagara Falls, then rose into the clouds toward the moon. The ship landed on a papier-mâché lunar landscape. Passengers got out and met costumed actors playing moon people, called Selenites. The whole thing was an early version of what we'd now call immersive theatre, or virtual reality. It was a massive hit. People waited in line for hours. When the exposition ended, Thompson and Dundee had made serious money. George C. Tilio, owner of Steeplechase Park at Coney Island in Brooklyn, saw the moon ride at Buffalo. He invited Thompson and Dundee to bring it to Coney Island for the 1902 season. They negotiated a 60-40 revenue split in their favour. The 1902 season at Coney Island was terrible. Out of 92 operating days, 70 were rainy. Most outdoor attractions lost money, but Thompson and Dundee's rides were indoor attractions. They still made a profit. Steeplechase Park was the only place at Coney Island that stayed profitable that summer. At the end of the season, Tillieu offered them a new contract for 1903. Worse terms. He wanted a bigger cut. Thompson and Dundee said no. Paul Boyton owned Sea Lion Park, a 16-acre enclosed amusement park that had opened in 1895 as the first permanent fenced amusement park in North America. The rainy 1902 season had killed him financially. He wanted out. Thompson and Dundee looked at Sea Lion Park in August 1902 and made Boyton an offer. They'd lease the land long-term and buy his remaining attractions. Boyton accepted. Thompson and Dundee had 9 months to build something before the 1903 season started. What they built changed everything. The rise. Thompson designed Luna Park like nothing that existed. He later described his approach as eliminating all classic conventional forms. He drew inspiration from Oriental architecture, Renaissance design, but twisted it into something completely new, curved lines instead of straight, spires, minarets, domes, towers, all covered in electric lights. The centerpiece was a 200-foot electric tower standing in the middle of a lagoon. It had 20,000 lights and waterfalls at its base. The rest of the park featured over 1,000 red and white spires and towers. At night, 250,000 electric lights illuminated the whole thing. This wasn't decoration. This was the point. Luna Park was designed to be experienced at night, when electricity transformed it into something that looked like it came from another world. Russian author Maxim Gorky visited and described it as a fantastic city, all of fire suddenly rising from the ocean into the sky. The electricity bill was enormous. Edison Company estimated it would cost $250 per day just to run the lights. They built a dedicated power plant on site. By 1912, Luna Park was using 1.4 million bulbs across 2,000 towers. The electric bill alone would bankrupt most businesses, but Thompson and Dundee understood something crucial. The lights weren't an expense, they were the product. People came to see Electric Fairyland as much as to ride the attractions. Construction happened at insane speed through fall and winter of 1902 to 1903. Over 500 workers tearing down the old Sea Lion Park, except for the Shoot the Chutes water ride, which they kept as a central attraction. Thompson redesigning A Trip to the Moon with better effects and a bigger ship that could accommodate more passengers. New buildings going up constantly, even as winter made construction difficult. Moving the trip to the moon attraction from Steeplechase Park to the new Luna Park site was its own drama. Topsy, an elephant that came with the purchase of Sea Lion Park, was supposed to help move the massive set pieces. Her handler, William Alt, was brutal with her. When Topsy couldn't budge a particularly heavy piece alone, Alt stabbed her with a fork between the eyes and on the sides. Police intervened. Alt was arrested for disorderly conduct. Topsy eventually did help move the ride, with assistance from a team of horses pulling on an oiled midway. Topsy's story would end tragically. She developed a reputation, deserved or not, as a man-killing elephant after several incidents. Thompson and Dundee decided she had to go. Thomas Edison's company filmed Topsy's ending in January 1903, using it to demonstrate the power of electricity. The footage still exists and remains disturbing. It's one of the darker chapters in Luna Park's early history, though Dundee came to regret it. After Topsy, Dundee became protective of the other elephants and animals in the park. Elephant rides became one of Luna Park's most beloved features, with the animals walking children through the various themed villages scattered across the grounds. They were running out of money constantly. Dundee found investors among wealthy gamblers and businessmen at Coney Island's racetracks. He convinced a steel magnate called Better Million Gates and a champagne salesman named George Kessler to invest heavily. When they needed more money halfway through construction, Dundee went to Wall Street and found more investors. Dundee had a peculiar sales technique. He'd be giving his pitch, stammering through it, he stuttered naturally. And suddenly he'd remove his toupee mid-sentence without pausing, exposing his bald head. It disarmed potential clients completely. They'd be so startled, they'd forget they were skeptical about the investment. The day Luna Park opened, Thompson and Dundee had $12 between them, just enough to make change at the ticket booths. Their clothes were so worn out from months of non-stop work that they had to borrow suits from their valet, who'd worked all winter without pay, believing in the project enough to defer his wages. May 16th, 1903, at 8:05 p.m, exactly at sunset on that Saturday evening, Luna Park opened its gates. The timing was deliberate. Thompson wanted people to enter as daylight faded so they could see the transformation when the electric lights came on. Between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock p.m, an estimated 60,000 people streamed through 5 entrance gates, overwhelming any crowd control attempts. People could barely move, but nobody cared. They were experiencing something entirely new. The entrance gates themselves were spectacular. Ornately carved, chariot-shaped ticket booths created by Marcus Illians, the master carousel carver who'd been operating a shop at 747 Dean Street in Brooklyn since 1897. He'd moved to Coney Island around 1903, and his shop would later relocate to 2739 Ocean Parkway to handle expanded business. Women dressed in white gowns with red feathered hats staffed the booths. The chariots were carved in the Coney Island style with jewels, scrollwork, and elaborate details that made buying a ticket feel as like part of the show. Admission was 10 cents. Rides cost extra, up to 25 cents for the biggest attractions like a trip to the moon and 20,000 leagues under the sea. But there were free shows throughout the park. Circuses in rings suspended over the lagoon, with acrobats performing while crowds gathered below, fire and flame shows. Foreign villages showing life in Germany, Ireland, Venice, the Philippines, India, complete with performers in traditional dress and reproductions of buildings and streets. Elephant and camel rides through the park, with children squealing as they rode on the animals' backs through the winding pathways. The Grand Canal, inspired by Venice, had gondoliers propelling their gondolas along the waterway, while visitors watched from bridges illuminated overhead. Along the canal edge were long rows of hand-cranked mutoscopes, early motion picture devices. For a penny, visitors could turn a crank and watch flickering flip card images showing everything from scenic views to slightly risque entertainment. The immediate reaction was awe. A reporter the next day claimed that the brilliance and beauty and weirdness of it all beggars description, as if language itself failed when confronted with what Thompson and Dundee had created. The New York Tribune wrote that Luna Park was the most completely electrically illuminated and most attractively laid out park, and there was nothing the most fastidious visitor could object to. This last part was important. Coney Island had a reputation for seediness, prostitution, gambling, and rough crowds. Luna Park was deliberately designed to be family-friendly, respectable, a place where middle-class parents could bring their children without worry. Harper's Weekly published an article 4 months after opening that captured what Luna Park represented. 2 young men came out of the West, the article said, and without any blowing of horns, erected as if in a night an amusement park which has not its counterpart anywhere else on Earth. The thinking visitor, after seeing the many features, after laughing at the helter-skelter and watching the Singalese dancers and making a trip to the moon and another via submarine route to the North Pole, would glance back after leaving the picturesque entrance and marvel at the inventive genius that made all this possible. By July 4th, 1903, Thompson and Dundee had recovered 90% of their construction costs. Less than 2 months from opening to nearly breaking even on a $700,000 investment. They recorded 142,000 guests on Independence Day alone, with visitors cramming into every available space. By the end of the first season, both men were wealthy, not just comfortable, wealthy. For the 1904 season, they expanded Luna Park by 16 acres, bringing the total to 38 acres. They purchased the land outright from Boynton instead of continuing to lease. This gave them full control and allowed even more ambitious plans. With over 1 million lights now, Luna Park became known as the most romantic amusement park ever built. Couples came for dates, walking hand in hand through the illuminated pathways, riding the gondolas, experiencing magic together. People called it the Electric Eden, the heart of Coney Island. Thompson and Dundee were relentless about innovation. They understood that novelty was crucial. People would come back for familiar attractions, but they needed new experiences to talk about, new reasons to spend money. If an attraction didn't make its money back in one season, it was in danger of being replaced. They were ruthless about this. Sentiment didn't matter. Business was business. In 1905, they removed 20,000 leagues under the sea, which had been one of the opening day attractions, and replaced it with Dragon's Gorge, an indoor scenic railway roller coaster designed by L.A. Thompson, no relation to Fred Thompson, who'd invented the roller coaster at Coney Island in 1884. This L.A. Thompson was the master of scenic railways, attractions that combined roller coaster thrills with elaborate painted scenes and theatrical elements. Dragon's Gorge took riders through scenes of the North Pole with icebergs and aurora borealis, Africa with jungles and exotic animals, the Grand Canyon with towering rock formations, and Hades with the river Styx and demons tormenting souls. The drops and dips of the indoor coaster increased the thrill and sensation of travelling faster than you actually were, while still being able to take in the scenery. It had the sharpest curves and steepest drops of any scenic railroad at Coney Island when it opened. It was so popular, it remained in the park for 39 years, until the 1944 fire finally destroyed it. One of the most ambitious spectacles was Fire and Flames, which opened in 1904. This wasn't a ride, it was pure theatre on a massive scale. A 4-storey brick building, constructed specifically to be burned repeatedly, stood in the park. During performances, special effects made it appear the building was on fire. Smoke poured from windows. Flames, created through controlled burns and theatrical lighting, appeared to consume the structure. Hired firemen, led by Chief Henry W. McAdams, who'd been chief instructor and drill master of the New York Fire Department for 21 years, responded with authentic fire equipment. Fire engines, hook and ladder trucks, and water tower companies raced to the scene. Actors playing trapped residents appeared in windows, screaming for help. Some leaped from smoke-filled upper floors into nets held by firemen below. The rescue operations looked completely real because they essentially were. The equipment was real. The techniques were authentic. Only the fire was controlled theatre. 1,000 people took part in this performance nightly between performers, firefighters, and support staff. It cost a fortune to run, but it packed in audiences who'd never seen anything like it. The show ran for years, becoming one of Luna Park's signature attractions. In 1905, Thompson and Dundee expanded beyond Coney Island. They built the Hippodrome in Manhattan, a huge indoor stadium on 6th Avenue between 43rd and 44th Streets, designed for spectacular theatrical productions. The Hippodrome could seat 5,300 people and featured an enormous stage with a pool that could be filled with water for aquatic spectacles. It was the largest theatre in the world when it opened. The competition noticed Luna Park's success. Former state senator William H. Reynolds, who had money and ambition, announced plans in July 1903 to build a third major park at Coney Island. Dreamland opened in 1904, just 1 year after Luna Park. Reynolds wanted it to surpass Luna Park in every way, and he spent accordingly. Dreamland featured 1 million lights, 4 times as many as Luna Park's original 250,000. Its central tower was even bigger. The architecture was more refined, more classical, less whimsical than Luna Park's fantasy oriental style. Dreamland presented itself as more sophisticated, more educational, with attractions like The End of the World, showing apocalyptic visions and elaborate reproductions of disasters. The marketing emphasized high-class entertainment and moral uplift rather than pure escapist fun. At Coney Island's peak in the mid-1900s, 3 major amusement parks competed. Steeplechase Park, which had opened in 1897 and appealed to people who wanted interactive, participatory entertainment where the rides literally threw you into physical contact with other guests. Luna Park, with its electric fantasy and romantic atmosphere, and Dreamland, with its claims of refinement and spectacle, plus dozens of independent attractions, sideshows, games, and concessions filled every available space along the beach and boardwalk. The area drew millions of visitors annually. On a summer weekend, the crowds were almost unmanageable. The Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company operated express trains directly from Park Row Terminal in Manhattan to Luna Park's main entrance during operating hours. This arrangement continued until 1909, making it incredibly easy for Manhattan residents to reach Coney Island. Luna Park employed over 2,000 people each season. It accommodated 5 million guests per year. The park had its own wireless and telegraph offices, functioning as a self-contained city dedicated entirely to entertainment. Workers lived nearby, often in boarding houses or small apartments within walking distance. Many spent their entire careers at Luna Park, generation after generation working at the park. The rides kept coming, each more inventive than the last. The Tickler, added in 1907, where people rode in spinning circular tubs down a winding track, while fences on either side kept knocking the tubs in different directions. The Virginia Reel, invented by Park Superintendent Henry Elmer Reel, and named after his daughter Virginia, which had circular spinning cars that zigzagged down a side-friction roller coaster in 1908. The Top, added in 1917, was a massive 45-ton spinning wheel that was 70 feet wide and travelled along a 3,200-foot track. It was removed after 1921, perhaps because maintenance costs exceeded revenue. The Mile Sky Chaser, which arrived in 1924 and stretched around nearly half the park with drops of more than 70 feet, became the biggest and longest ride at Coney Island. Witching Waves, added in 1907, used an undulating floor to propel small cars up and down in a disorienting motion. The Bridge of Laughs was a wobbly bridge designed specifically to make you stumble and grab onto whoever you were with. Everything was calculated to involve visitors physically, to create shared experiences, to give couples excuses to hold on to each other. Everything was designed to be spectacular, immersive, overwhelming. The goal wasn't just to entertain people for a few hours. The goal was to transport them to another world entirely, to make them forget ordinary life completely, to create memories that would last a lifetime. And for a while, it worked perfectly. Luna Park was making enormous profits. Thompson and Dundee were celebrities, recognised on sight at Coney Island. Newspapers covered their every move. The future looked unlimited, as bright as 1,000,000 electric lights blazing against the night sky. Then everything started falling apart, and it happened faster than anyone could have predicted. The cracks. February 5th, 1907. Elmer Dundee died suddenly. Heart failure from severe pneumonia. He was 44 years old. 2 weeks earlier, on January 27th, Dundee had visited Luna Park with his mother to check on 6 new attractions planned for the upcoming season. Doctors had been certain he would recover. He'd spoken with Thompson just an hour before his heart gave out. Dundee's death was catastrophic for Luna Park. Thompson had the creative vision, but Dundee handled the business. Dundee knew how to raise money, manage costs, deal with contractors and investors. He kept Thompson's worst financial impulses in check. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle said Dundee's death was a severe blow to Thompson. That's an understatement. Without Dundee, Thompson had no one to stop him from spending whatever he wanted, and Thompson was going through changes in his personal life that made everything worse. On February 29th, 1906, he'd married Mabel Taliaferro, a stage actress. Thompson became obsessed with making his wife a star. He took her on extravagant vacations. He produced major theatrical productions specifically to cast her in lead roles. Sometimes the reviews were good, sometimes they weren't. Thompson's attention shifted away from Luna Park toward managing Mabel's career. He was neglecting the business that had made him wealthy. Meanwhile, his drinking was getting worse. Thompson had always liked alcohol, but Dundee had kept him somewhat restrained. Without Dundee, Thompson drank more. The finances started deteriorating. Thompson had complete disregard for costs in both the park and his personal life. Luna Park was expensive to maintain. All those lights, the shows with 1,000 performers, the constant need for new attractions. The electricity bills alone were crushing. And Thompson kept spending. New rides, elaborate shows. Whatever struck his creative fancy, he built, regardless of whether it would make money back. In 1907, Thompson added a carousel called the Ocean Wave. He expanded the ballroom and lagoon. He relocated the entrance away from the elevated train lines. He employed 4 elephants and 700 men during the off-season, just for improvements. The park was still popular. It was still drawing huge crowds. But the profit margins were shrinking. Maintenance costs were rising. Competition from Dreamland and Steeplechase was intensifying. Then Thompson's marriage collapsed. He divorced Mabel in 1911. The divorce crushed him emotionally and financially. His drinking accelerated. His decision-making got worse. By October 1910, the New York State Banking Department wanted to place Luna Park into receivership because the firm of Thompson and Dundee had gone bankrupt. Park lawyers argued that the firm no longer controlled Luna Park, so a receiver wasn't appointed. But the writing was on the wall. In 1911, the Luna Amusement Company, headed by Baron Collier, a publisher of advertising and magazines, took over the park. Thompson continued running it as manager in title, but he'd lost ownership. In December 1911, a fire destroyed the park's scenery storage building, a restaurant, and 2 rides. This was several months after Dreamland had burned down completely. Dreamland's fire in 1911 was one of many fires that plagued Coney Island in this era. The parks were filled with wooden structures, electric wiring, and highly flammable materials. In March 1912, the Sea Beach Land Company and Charles C. Overton moved to evict Thompson. The eviction was finalised in April. Thompson officially lost Luna Park to creditors in 1912, 5 years after Dundee's death. Thompson remarried in 1913 to Celine Wheat Pilcher from Nashville. He left for San Francisco to design and build an amusement park called Toyland at the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition. Toyland failed to gain traction. The world was focused on World War I. Nobody cared about amusement parks when Europe was tearing itself apart. Thompson died on June 6, 1919, at age 45. He'd been a genius, created something revolutionary, made and lost a fortune, and died relatively young, largely forgotten. Luna Park continued without him, but it was never the same. The decline. Baron Collier ran Luna Park from 1912 to 1935. He tried to maintain it as a family amusement park, continuing the tradition Thompson and Dundee had established. He added new attractions when he could afford them, kept things running as smoothly as possible, maintained the electric lights and the fantasy architecture. But the golden age was over. Everyone could feel it. The park still drew crowds. It was still profitable some years. But it wasn't the phenomenon it had been in the first decade. The magic had faded somehow. Part of it was Thompson's absence. Say what you want about his personal problems, the man had genius. His creative vision had made Luna Park special. Without him constantly pushing for new innovations, the park felt more ordinary. In 1920, the subway reached Coney Island. The opening of the subway extension changed everything about who came to the area and why. For a nickel, thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers could get to Coney Island directly from Manhattan, Brooklyn, even Queens. No need to take a train to a ferry or pay for expensive transit. 5 cents, 1 ride, straight to the beach. This sounds like it should have been great for business. In some ways it was. Attendance absolutely soared. On a summer Saturday, the crowds were overwhelming. The beaches were packed. The boardwalk was shoulder to shoulder with humanity. 1 million people might show up on a perfect summer day, but the clientele changed fundamentally. Luna Park had been built for the middle class, families with disposable income, people who could afford 10-cent admission plus rides at 10 to 25 cents each, plus food, plus games, plus souvenirs. People who came intending to spend money and have a special day out. The subway brought working-class crowds, factory workers, immigrants, people with very limited money. They'd saved their nickel for the subway ride. Maybe they had a dime for admission to one of the parks. Maybe not. Maybe enough for 1 ride, or just enough to buy a hot dog and spend the day on the free beach. These weren't bad people. They deserved access to the beach and to affordable entertainment just as much as anyone. But from Luna Park's business perspective, they weren't the target market. They came, they walked around enjoying the free sights. Maybe they bought something small, and they went home. The revenue per visitor dropped dramatically. Coney Island became known as the People's Playground. The name was meant affectionately, celebrating that ordinary working people could afford to visit. And there was something wonderful about that democratization of leisure. But for the amusement parks that had been built for a different economic model, it was a slow catastrophe. The crowds couldn't match the cost of upkeep. Luna Park was expensive to run. fantastically expensive. All that electricity and electricity costs kept rising. All those performers for the shows. The constant maintenance on aging rides and structures. Wood rotted, metal corroded in the salt air. Paint faded under the sun and needed constant refreshing. Equipment broke down. The original rides from 1903 were now 20, 30 years old. They needed major overhauls or replacements. That required capital investment, and the money wasn't there. The park started looking shabby. Not terrible, but no longer pristine. Paint peeled here and there. Some lights didn't work. Small things, but they accumulated. The park started losing money year after year. Some years were worse than others, but the trend was clear. Luna Park was a business in decline, trying to maintain early 1900s infrastructure and operating costs with 1920s and 1930s revenues that couldn't support them. New amusements were drawing visitors away from Coney Island entirely. Movies were becoming huge in the 1920s. For a dime or a quarter, you could sit in a movie palace with air conditioning, plush seats, and an orchestra, watching feature films that transported you to exotic locations and told compelling stories. You got to sit down for 2 hours instead of walking around in the heat. For many people, especially during hot summer days, the movies were more appealing than Coney Island. The automobile gave people other entertainment options too. If you owned a car or knew someone who did, you could drive to other beaches, other parks, other destinations. Coney Island wasn't the only option anymore. Competition for leisure dollars intensified from every direction. The Great Depression hit in October 1929. Everything that had been difficult before became impossible, making even dime leisure a luxury most people couldn't afford when they were worried about food and rent. Luna Park went into bankruptcy multiple times starting in 1933. Creditors foreclosed on the park twice during the Depression. Owners came and went, each one hoping they could turn it around, each one eventually giving up when the numbers wouldn't work. Nobody could make it profitable. The shows and attractions that had seemed so spectacular in 1903 felt dated by the 1930s. Technology had advanced. People's expectations had changed. A papier-mâché moon didn't impress anyone anymore when they could watch sophisticated special effects in Hollywood movies. Tarzan swinging through jungle sets, King Kong climbing the Empire State Building, Flash Gordon flying through space. Luna Park's theatrical tricks seemed quaint by comparison. Charles Miller took control of the park in 1935 and ran it through 1941. He tried to modernise, but there wasn't enough money for major renovations. He did what he could, adding new attractions when possible, maintaining what existed, trying to keep the magic alive even as everything around the park changed. In 1939, New York hosted another World's Fair in Flushing Meadows, Queens. The fair was enormous, showcasing technology and culture from around the world. It drew millions of visitors over 2 seasons in 1939 and 1940. While the fair was operating, it competed directly with Coney Island for tourist dollars. But when the fair closed at the end of the 1940 season, it left behind hundreds of attractions and exhibits that needed homes. Miller and a group of investors, including Edward and Harry Lee Danziger and Milton Sheen, signed a lease to take over Luna Park in December 1940. They had ambitious plans. They'd relocate 15 attractions from the World's Fair to Luna Park. They'd add a building for commercial exhibits, showcasing products and innovations. They'd build a swimming pool, a ballroom for dancing and live music, more live shows, a complete revitalization. They invested heavily. Luna Park's managers spent $9 million rebuilding and installing new attractions. $9,019,040. That's roughly $195 million today. They rebranded the park as the New York World's Fair of 1941, capitalizing on the name recognition and the association with modern entertainment. For a moment, it looked like Luna Park might have a renaissance. The new attractions from the World's Fair were genuinely impressive. Attendance picked up. There was excitement about the park again. Maybe it could recapture some of the magic that had made it special 4 decades earlier. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The United States entered World War II. Everything changed overnight. Luna Park was allowed to stay open during the war. The government understood that civilian morale mattered. People needed places to escape the constant worry about loved ones overseas, about the war news, about rationing and shortages. Entertainment wasn't frivolous during wartime. It was necessary. But war restrictions fundamentally changed what Luna Park could be. Dim-out regulations, designed to prevent enemy planes or submarines from using bright lights to target the coast, required that park lighting couldn't be seen from the air or ocean. Luna Park, which had made its entire reputation on spectacular illumination, on 250,000 and then 1 million electric lights blazing against the night sky, had to use soft blue and dark purple lamps instead. The effect was completely different. Instead of the brilliant fantasy city of fire, Luna Park at night looked subdued, almost eerie. One reporter described it as having the air of a country fair illuminated by Japanese lanterns. Charming in its way, but nothing like the overwhelming spectacle that had defined the park. Where Luna once stood for light, for electric brilliance that banished darkness and transformed ordinary reality, it was now dark and dreary. The fantasy element was gone. You could see it was an amusement park, but the magic required darkness and blazing light in contrast. With dim lighting, it was just structures and rides. Building materials for repairs became almost impossible to obtain. Everything metal, everything rubber, everything that could potentially help the war effort was rationed or unavailable. Steel for repairing ride structures, rubber for bumper cars and seals on water rides. Even paint was hard to get. The park had to make do with aging equipment and structures that couldn't be properly maintained. New attractions were impossible. Manufacturing was entirely devoted to military production. Nobody was making amusement park rides when they could be making bombers and tanks. Luna Park had to run with what it had, and what it had was aging fast. Still, people came. Not as many as before the Depression, and they weren't spending much. But Luna Park stayed open through 1942 and 1943. Attendance held up reasonably well, all things considered. Workers from defence plants came on their days off. Soldiers and sailors on leave visited with their girlfriends. Families scraped together nickels and dimes for a few hours of normalcy. In February 1944, several concessions were damaged in a fire. Minor damage. Most of the park remained untouched. Just another setback in a long series of setbacks. The managers assessed the damage, made temporary repairs, and kept operating. It seemed like just another problem to work around. In August 1944, a syndicate composed of Edward and Harry Lee Danziger, William Miller, and Milton Sheen agreed to purchase Luna Park from Prudence Bonds for an estimated $275,000, which included a $125,000 purchase money mortgage. They weren't scheduled to take title until September 15th, which gave them time to finalise financing and plans. Miller planned to renovate the park extensively for the 1945 season. The war was clearly winding down. Everyone could see Germany and Japan were losing. Soon there'd be peace, and with peace would come prosperity. Veterans would come home, families would have money again, the economy would boom, Luna Park could be revitalised, restored to something approaching its former glory. Miller wanted to rename it Bill Miller's Luna Park, putting his own stamp on the property. He had money, he had vision, he had plans for bringing Luna Park back. new rides when manufacturing restarted for civilian purposes, fresh paint, repairs to everything that had been deferred during the Depression and the war, a grand reopening that would remind people why Luna Park had been special in the first place. He never got the chance. None of them did. The end. August 12th, 1944. Saturday afternoon. A busy summer day at Luna Park. About 10,000 people in the park. A fire started in Dragon's Gorge, the indoor scenic railway that had been one of Luna Park's most popular attractions since 1905. Nobody knows exactly what caused it. Some reports suggested a cigarette thrown into a trash can. Others thought it might have been electrical wiring in the aging ride. Dragon's Gorge had straw roofs covering parts of the attraction. The fire spread quickly across the straw. Within minutes, the entire ride was engulfed. The fire reached Luna Park's towers. Embers began spewing everywhere. The wind carried burning debris across the western half of the park. Firefighters responded, but there wasn't much they could do. The park was filled with old wooden structures covered in decades of paint and varnish. Everything was tinder. The fire spread from attraction to attraction. Among the structures destroyed, Dragon's Gorge, the Mile Sky Chaser roller coaster, which had been the biggest and longest ride at Coney Island when it opened in 1924, the Coca-Cola Tower, various games and flat rides, the entire western half of the park. The damage was estimated at $800,000. That's roughly $13 million in today's money. The main entrance, administration building, swimming pool, and other rides near the park's entrance weren't seriously damaged. The fire had destroyed about 90% of the park's attractions, but some infrastructure remained. The undamaged part of Luna Park reopened on August 18th, 6 days after the fire. It continued operating through September 15th, 1944, when the purchase was supposed to be finalised, but Miller and the Danzigers couldn't finalise the purchase. The insurance situation was complicated. The park was a wreck. Rebuilding would cost more than buying new land and starting fresh. World War II was still ongoing, making construction materials scarce and expensive. The eastern half of Luna Park closed permanently on September 15th, 1944. What was left of the park sat vacant while lawyers fought over insurance money and property rights. In August 1946, a company purchased the remains of Luna Park, not to rebuild it, to demolish it. The plan was to tear down everything and build Quonset huts for military veterans and their families. That didn't happen either. The site remained largely vacant for years. Some rides on Surf Avenue continued operating after 1944 under independent operators, but Luna Park itself was gone. Robert Moses, New York's master builder who reshaped the city through massive public works projects, asked the city to transfer Luna Park's land to the Parks Department in 1949. The request was granted. Moses had the land rezoned for residential use. He wanted to demolish about a third of the attractions along Surf Avenue and replace them with housing. Moses believed fewer people were going to Coney Island because they preferred places like Jones Beach State Park, where they could swim outdoors, rather than Coney Island's mechanical gadget attractions. Between 1958 and 1962, the Luna Park houses were built on the site. 5 apartment buildings, public housing. No trace of the amusement park remained except in photographs and memories. 41 years from opening to final destruction. From 1903 to 1944, an entire era of American entertainment gone. The aftermath. People who remember Luna Park talk about it in ways that sound almost mythical. The lights, the music from the bands and mechanical organs, the smell of food from the concession stands, the sounds of laughter and screaming, the pure joy of being in a place designed solely to make you happy. Virginia L. Steiner remembered sitting at her bedroom window on Stillwell Avenue with her mother and sister, watching Luna Park burn in August 1944. the flames visible from blocks away, the smoke rising into the summer sky, feeling hot ashes hitting her as the fire consumed decades of memories. Holly M. remembered her father working at Luna Park, one of the 2,000 employees who kept the fantasy running. Families where 3 generations had worked at Luna Park, passing down knowledge of how rides operated, where to find the best food, which shows were worth seeing. Workers took pride in keeping the magic alive. It wasn't just a job. It was being part of something that made people happy. Luna Park appeared in movies, preserving images of what it looked like. Roscoe Arbuckle's 1917 film Coney Island shows the park. The 1928 Oscar-nominated movie The Crowd by King Vidor has scenes filmed there. Harold Lloyd's 1928 movie Speedy was partly filmed at Luna Park. These films exist in archives now, evidence that Luna Park was real, that it looked the way people describe it. Billy Murray recorded a song called Meet Me Down at Luna, Lena in 1905. Explicitly promotional, but popular enough to stick around. The song was re-recorded for a 2007 documentary about Coney Island's history. The park inspired dozens of imitators worldwide. Frederick Ingersoll opened 44 Luna Parks around the world, creating the first chain of amusement parks. Charles Loof opened one in Seattle in 1907. Luna Parks spread across Europe, South America, Australia. Today, the term Luna Park is a generic word meaning amusement park in several languages, including Polish, French, Italian, Russian, Croatian, Czech, Serbian, Bosnian, Slovenian, Greek, Turkish, Hungarian, and Hebrew. The original Luna Park became the name for an entire category of entertainment. Luna Park wasn't just an amusement park, it was proof of concept for an entirely new form of entertainment. It demonstrated you could create a completely immersive environment, that people would pay to escape reality for a few hours, that electricity and theatrical staging could transform ordinary spaces into magical ones. Walt Disney studied Luna Park when designing Disneyland in the early 1950s. The emphasis on theming, on creating environments that transport visitors to different worlds, on attention to every detail, on designing experiences rather than just building rides, all came from what Thompson and Dundee pioneered. Disneyland opened in 1955, 11 years after Luna Park burned. Disney's vision was more sophisticated, more technologically advanced, but the fundamental concept, the idea of creating a complete fantasy world through a threshold that leaves behind the ordinary world, that's pure Luna Park. In 2010, a new amusement park opened near Coney Island and took the Luna Park name. It's on the site where Astroland operated from 1962 to 2008, across Surf Avenue from where the original stood. The new park has modern rides, games, food, and live entertainment. Its entrance echoes the original's fantasy architecture. But it's not the same thing. It can't be. The original existed in a specific moment when electricity was new and magical, when amusement parks were revolutionary, when people didn't have 1,000 entertainment options. Going to Luna Park in 1903 was an event, something you planned for and talked about for weeks afterward. The Luna Park houses still stand on the original site, at West 8th Street and Neptune Avenue. 5 apartment buildings where 250,000 electric lights once blazed. People live there, raise families, mostly unaware of what existed before. The ground holds no trace of the towers, the lagoon, the electric tower, the Dragon's Gorge. Occasionally, workers doing construction uncover remnants, pieces of foundation, fragments of decorative elements, bits of old metal or glass that might have been part of a ride, fragments of the past buried under decades of development revealed briefly, then reburied or discarded. What's left exists in photographs, grainy black and white images showing towers and crowds, in old films, jerky footage of people riding attractions that no longer exist, in memories fading as the people who experienced it pass away, in the influence it had on every amusement park that came after, an influence so complete most people don't realise where the ideas originated, in the idea that it's possible to create a place solely dedicated to joy, to making people forget troubles and just experience wonder. That's what Luna Park was, a place where, for 10 cents admission, you could step into a fantasy for a few hours and pretend the ordinary world didn't exist. Thompson and Dundee weren't perfect. Thompson's drinking and financial recklessness destroyed what he'd created. Dundee died too young, at 44. Both had serious flaws, made serious mistakes. But what they built in 1903 was extraordinary. They took an idea, borrowed money, 9 months of construction, and created something that 50 years later people still called the greatest amusement park that had ever existed. They proved entertainment could be art, that commerce and creativity could combine into something magical. The fact that it didn't last makes it somehow more poignant. Nothing gold can stay. Luna Park burned bright for 4 decades, then burned literally, then faded into history like smoke dissipating into the sky. But the idea survived. The concept that you can build a place where ordinary rules don't apply, where imagination creates reality, where electric lights can make the night disappear and transform steel and wood into a fantastic city that exists only to make people happy. That's Luna Park's real legacy. Not the physical structures, which are gone, not the specific rides, which are obsolete. The legacy is the understanding that given sufficient creativity, ambition, and electricity, you can build anything. You can create worlds that never existed and make people believe in them, if only for a few hours. That's what Thompson and Dundee understood. That's what made Luna Park matter. And that's what survives, long after the last light has gone out. On the site where Luna Park once stood, people live their lives in apartment buildings, mostly unaware of what was there before. The lights are long extinguished. The towers are gone. The lagoon is filled in. The electric tower, which once rose 200 feet and could be seen for miles, exists only in photographs. But somewhere in storage, in archives, in old photo albums, images remain of what Luna Park looked like when all 250,000 lights were blazing and the towers seemed to rise from the ocean into the sky. For people who saw it, who experienced it, those images don't capture a fraction of what it really was. But they're better than nothing. The past is gone, but it was here, and it mattered, and it changed everything that came after. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.